Well, welcome to inspiration.org. I'm so glad that you were able to join us today, and I have a wonderful special guest, my good friend Ryan Bomberger of the Radiance Foundation. Welcome, Ryan. So glad that you're here.
It's good to be here with you, Craig. So glad to have a conversation with you.
Absolutely. For those who don't know about your organization, tell us a little bit about your background and a little bit about the Radiance Foundation.
Sure. My background is one of adoption. I grew up in a family of 15. I have 6 brothers and 6 sisters. I know, tiny little family. 10 of us were adopted and loved. All of us were loved like crazy. So that's really my background. I'm one of those fringe examples, you could say, that sometimes pro-lifers have a hard time embracing as well. But I was conceived in rape. But the great part of that story is that I was adopted in love. And so growing up in a family situation where parents shattered the myth of the unwanted child, we were all wanted. I mean, we may not be wanted by a biological parent or parents, but we're all wanted by someone. And so growing up in a family, a diverse family, by the way, we're white and black, Native American, Vietnamese. Some of my siblings have physical disabilities. Some have learning disabilities, and everyone in our family has special needs. Everyone watching has special needs, and that's to love and to be loved. So that's my background. I'm also now happily married, father of 4. 2 of my kiddos were also adopted. So that's my DNA, just to grow up loved, regardless of circumstances, because the circumstances of our conception do not change the condition of our worth. So that's my background. My wife and I started the Radiance Foundation about 12 years ago. And my wife was a teacher for 13 years in public and private school. I was a creative director in the ad agency world for the same amount of time. And we wanted to engage on culture shifting, culture shaping issues and equip Christians especially to have the confidence to engage on these issues. While the world is shouting a lie, too many of us are just being quiet. And that shouldn't be the way it is. So we started the Radiance Foundation to illuminate that every human life has purpose.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I love your T-shirts, less activism and more factivism. Tell us a little bit about what that means and why you would put it on a T-shirt and put it up on billboards and other things like that.
Well, I don't know if you noticed, but activism has been pretty active lately in our culture and our society. I mean, it's been kind of a trademark of the American life. But my issue is that there are too many people who act without the facts. We are emotional beings. Yes, we are. But as Christians, especially, it's our responsibility to know the context of issues so that we're not acting irrationally. And so the best way for us to act responsibly and to act with compassion is to know the facts. Be moved, of course, by these emotions. God made us that way. But as a factivist, I try to bring context, which then brings clarity to issues. So that's why I say less activism, more factivism. Be a factivist.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, there was an activist that once approached the great African-American leader, Frederick Douglass, towards the end of his life. And he asked him for advice on how to be an activist. And I love what Frederick Douglass said. He said, agitate, 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 agitate. What do you think of that answer? And is that a part of what you do through the Radiance Foundation?
I think before I ever even heard of Frederick Douglass, I knew about agitating. I was really good at it. Probably not what he was talking about, but when you're a family of 15, you have to do something to stand out. But honestly, I love Frederick Douglass. My mom, who was an avid reader, the reason why I read as much as I read and continue to read a lot, she put forth all these incredible American heroes, and I would read their history. And Frederick Douglass was one of the first ones I remember in elementary school. And I loved his story and I loved his courage and, starting the North Star. So it's exactly what the Radiance Foundation is predicated on, because sometimes people feel like, I tried this once. Well, that's the thing about agitate, 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 agitate. You have to keep going because sometimes you're going to fail the first time and the second time and the third time. And you keep going until you experience that justice, until you get that victory. And so I'm all about it. That's definitely part of my DNA. It's part of the DNA of the Radiance Foundation.
Without an agitator, our clothes don't get clean in the wash, right?
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
Try that.
It's really good. Hey, tell me some of the Black leaders, especially leaders of faith through history, who have really been role models for you.
I would say one of my first role models, aside from Frederick Douglass, who of course was a man of faith and an incredible, articulate man who, to this day, his words are so prescient and so applicable to what's going on in our culture today. But George Washington Carver, I would say, would be one of those. He was such a humble man. He could have been insanely wealthy, and he didn't choose wealth. In a day and age where eugenicists were trying to eliminate certain human beings, George Washington Carver was using the brilliance God gave him to elevate human beings. And I mean, people know him. They think about, peanuts and peanut butter. And I'm like, there were hundreds of things that he came up with, uses of plants, soybeans, and peanuts were one of them too. But I just loved his kind spirit and the fact that this humble man who always wore a little flower and was always talking to flowers, he loved God's creation. Not just the plants, but he loved the human beings that God created as well. And so he's one of my heroes. There are so many. Benjamin Banneker, another hero of mine, who was born to a former slave. I remember reading the story about Benjamin Banneker and just marveling at, here in a day and age where a lot of slaves, first of all, risked their lives just to read, just to be educated. Yeah. Although he was not a slave, he was self-taught. So there are many barriers in his life, but yet he overcame so many barriers, becoming, let's see here, an author, a surveyor, a landowner, a mathematician, an astronomer, all self-taught. His almanac, Banneker's almanac. I mean, here he was predicting solar and lunar eclipses.
Wow.
A brilliant man, a humble man, and he also, built clocks from like scratch. I tried to do that too, and it didn't go so well. I'm just saying I'm not putting myself down. I'm just saying we all have our areas of specialization, but he was a brilliant man who was sought after by George Washington's advisors to help lay out the boundaries for federal district, DC. And I love this instance where he wrote to Thomas Jefferson, who I believe was the Secretary of State at the time, and he wrote to him about his whole perception of blacks and whites. He thought, Thomas Jefferson wrote specifically, that blacks were inferior both in body and in mind. No. And so Benjamin Banneker graciously wrote this letter and basically was saying, yeah, we're not inferior. By the way, here's a copy of my almanac from a self-taught individual, the son of a former slave. And so it's just, for me, he's just one of the most brilliant ones. There's Dr. Mildred Jefferson, a more recent historical figure. She was the first Black woman to graduate from Harvard Medical School. She was the first female surgeon at Boston Medical. She was the co-founder of the National Right to Life Committee, 28 honorary degrees, just a brilliant, incredible woman who grew up in Jim Crow America, grew up fighting sexism, and yet achieved so much. And she was passionately against abortion. She fought to defend the most defenseless. So as a physician, she cared for the sick and the poor, and she also fought the abortion industry and the pseudoscience of eugenics. So those are just a handful. I could rattle off so many more.
Yeah. Well, along those same lines, and here we get you to rattle a few more. When you're thinking about raising up your children and your grandchildren, what are some of the stories and who are some of the Black leaders and Black leaders of faith that you want to make sure that your kids and your grandkids know about?
Well, the ones that I've mentioned, Frederick Douglass in particular, when I talk to my children, I talk about how sometimes you might feel like something is unfair, that everything is against you. What do you do? So in his day and age, for instance, mainstream media wasn't telling the truth about slavery, which, fast forward all these years, mainstream media doesn't tell the truth about a lot of things.
Yeah.
But what do? Do you just sit back and say, I'm defeated, I can't do anything? Or do you start something like Frederick Douglass starting the North Star? And so for me, he is one of those heroes that my kids can understand, and they can apply that, because I mean, he lives in a far more dangerous culture, certainly, than my children, who are mixed, and my youngest son, who's adopted, two of my kiddos are adopted, but my youngest son is African-American or Black. And there's nothing stopping them. If they want to pursue a certain something, particularly if they're pursuing justice, there's nothing stopping them. So there's so many historical figures that they can look toward. Harriet Tubman is another one because she was a woman with some grit. I mean, you had this, and I love the movie, the recent movie that came out. I love that it showed that someone was willing to risk her life over and over and over again to rescue people from the tyranny, to rescue people from the hell that they were living in. And she just kept going back to it. You know, in our culture, we just like to be comfy. We like to binge watch and binge listen and do all this. Sometimes there's a disconnect, but I want my children to understand that the ultimate kind of sacrifice is giving your life for somebody else. That's far greater than you gratifying yourself with, possessions and all these other things. That it's far better to give up your life, to give up things in your life so that others can be set free. So there are a lot of great examples for my children, and regardless of their skin color, a lot of great examples for my children to look at to say, you know what, I want to have that kind of character. I want to have that kind of courage.
Yeah. Who are some Black leaders today that you think are really making a difference and making history that, years from now, they're going to look back and say they made an impact?
One of my favorite is Dr. Alveda King. Dr. Alveda King is the niece of Martin Luther King Jr., daughter of A.D. King. She, to me, truly carries the King legacy today. And this is one of those things one of those God-ordained, God-orchestrated things that blows my mind, that someone like me, who was conceived in rape and many say should have been aborted, that I'm working hand in hand with such an amazing and humble leader like Dr. Alveda King. She is today, to me, what should be the example of a civil rights leader. She fights on the spectrum of issues, but she doesn't ignore the fundamental issue, because without life, nothing else matters. And she is passionately pro-life. She's one of them. Reverend Dean Nelson, who is the founder of the Douglas Leadership Institute, good friend of mine, a man who he's a man of God who pursues righteousness and pursues justice. And the fact that he and I share that same love of Frederick Douglass, there are so many reasons to just admire Reverend Dean Nelson. There are so many more. Catherine Davis, who's been one of our colleagues in fighting this fight of abortion in the Black community. She's another just indefatigable leader. She just doesn't give up. And I love her passion for life. I love her passion for people. There are others who are perhaps a little more secular, who consider themselves people of faith, like a Kathy Hughes, who is the founder of Media One. And her story is really remarkable because she was a teenage mother and she was faced with the option of aborting her child. But instead, she said her son inspired her to be an entrepreneur.
Wow.
And she is, multi-million-dollar owner of Media One. And what an incredible story, because she did not have to sacrifice somebody else's life in order to be a success as far as the world is concerned. So there are a lot of present day, I think, heroes with complexion like mine who I would just love that I do uphold and that I do share with others.
Yeah, that's great. So let me turn the tables on you a little bit here. If I were a young activist coming to you like that young activist went to Frederick Douglass, and you can't use his answer, but
okay.
What would be some advice that you would give after you've been in the trenches, you've gone up against some really serious heavyweights in the culture wars, and you have, taken your licks, but you've also had some really significant triumphs. So what's your advice to someone starting out?
I think the most important thing is the way that you see the world. For me, it's 1 Corinthians 13:6 says, love does not delight in evil, but it rejoices in the truth. When you're looking through that kind of filter, you see things differently. You don't see people necessarily as your enemy, and you treat them with love and respect, because they also need to be set free as well. And even when you don't get that in return, it's okay. Scripture says that we're going to be hated for his name's sake. And so as a factivist today, I would really encourage people to understand that, oftentimes the world looks through this broken filter, and we have to look through God's breakthrough filter.
Mm.
And that's really important because it changes the way that you interact with people. It changes the way, like as a designer, it changes the way that I craft messaging, because I'm not trying to tear somebody down. I am definitely trying to condemn institutions, but I'm not trying to tear people down. And so that's one of the things I would encourage. Also, when it comes to media, mainstream media, just keep in mind that, okay, this may be an exaggeration, but I'm just going to put it out there anyway, because it doesn't feel like it's an exaggeration. 99.9% of the time, they don't know what they're talking about. I found this out the hard way. And so as someone who, regularly involved in news media, you have to understand that you're probably the expert on the issue, and you have to carry yourself that way. And in that process, you get to educate them. In that process, you have to remember that there are going to be false accusations thrown at you, and you have to constantly bring things back to the core issue. What is that central issue? Don't allow them to take you on all these rabbit trails. Understand why it is you're fighting for what it is, and that you're able to keep that centered and focused. So those for me are some of the crucial things as someone who wants to act against injustice. And because for me, without love, we're nothing.
Yeah.
And it's really hard to love some people. Even some of your colleagues, sometimes that could be hard too, but especially we are called to love our enemy. And so practicing that in real life is not easy, but it's mandatory.
Yeah,
it really is. And I think sometimes you see different results because of that sort of focus.
Yeah. You've been through the ringer from time to time, and I'm sure that there are days where it's exhausting. And, in what you do, you really have to have a thick skin. What kind of things do you and your wife do to help you maintain your sanity, help maintain peace in your home, help your children to, when they're kind of seeing what's going on and feeling a little, maybe even threatened by that? What's some of the advice you would give to someone who is entering this on how to maintain your own healing and health?
Well, it's interesting you ask that, since I just had a recent health scare, actually nearly lost my life back in October. One thing we forget, particularly as Christians, is we forget that rest is a spiritual weapon. We often think, I'm going to rest when I'm done with X, Y, and Z. Well, guess what? That often never happens. And then the alphabet starts all over again. And we're constantly doing the same thing. If we do not rest, God took a day to rest. I think if God took a day to rest, his Sabbath, that we need to implement that too. And that's crucial for anybody who wants to be involved in a movement, in a cause. You have to understand rest. As a very happily married man with 4 children, my family comes first. God, family, other stuff. And if you don't have that hierarchy correct, things are going to fall apart. Marriages will fall apart. Your relationship with your kids will fall apart. So I am for instance, I do a lot of live presentations, a lot of speaking events, about 60 events a year, although the COVID pandemic affected some of that. A lot of it moved to virtual, but there are times when I get invited to speak overseas for, 14-day tour or 10-day tour. If I were single, that would be okay. But you have to understand, what is your situation? What is your circumstance? And what should your focus be? So in my fight for justice, I'm not going to do the injustice of not spending the right amount of time with my family and giving them the time and attention that they deserve. So that for me is crucial. Now, for those who are single, you still have to understand, what is your priority? If that hierarchy, God has to be first, and then family, and that could be your extended family, and then work and all those other things. If you get those out of whack, trust me, things fall apart. Now, I talked about my health scare earlier. It was because of I was spending a lot of time with my family, absolutely, but I was also pushing myself way too hard, and just basically ignoring some of those signs of physical deterioration. And so my body was like, oh, okay, that's how it's going to be. Time to shut down. So we've got to maintain ourselves so that we can stay in the fight. So it's okay to rest. It's okay to say no.
Yeah.
It is okay. Even in fights that, like with the issue of abortion, there is an immediacy, there's an urgency, yes, but you have to be alive to fight it.
Mark Twain once said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that quote. Tell me what you think about that, and are we seeing some rhyming of history today?
Oh, we see it all the time. I think, unfortunately, it's just the nature of humanity to duplicate itself in the sense of duplicate its actions. So we may not have necessarily an exact repeating, but I like that. There is a rhyming. For instance, case in point is with the issue of abortion. Here you had, slavery and the abolition of slavery, and then you had Jim Crow, and then finally the abolition of those horrific racist policies, because certain segment of the population, and when I say certain segment, I'm not just going by color, because I don't do the whole blanket accusation thing. I hate that. But a certain segment of the population didn't believe that people of my complexion were persons. And today, in a different sort of form, but the same sort of issue, where we're denying another group of human beings their own personhood. And so, here's the rhyme. It's not people who are brown, but it is, well, actually, disproportionately when it comes to abortion, yes, it is Black lives that are disproportionately aborted, rates up to 5 times. So yes, for me, personhood is that rhyme that's happening right now.
Yeah.
How dare we pretend that we can be the arbiters of human value? Because whenever that happens throughout human history, it's never gone well, ever. It's always ended in discrimination, in destruction, and death.
Yeah. I want to go back to our buddy Frederick Douglass one more time. When Ulysses S. Grant passed away, Frederick Douglass said he was the best friend of the African Americans. And he gave a glowing quote to the newspaper at that time of what Ulysses S. Grant, Grant was not a perfect person. He made his mistakes, but he was a person who learned from his mistakes. And when he made mistakes, he would, and realized that it was a mistake, he would make it right, which is, I think, one of his great strengths. It was really ironic that earlier in 2020, a riot happened in San Francisco, and they pulled down the statue of Ulysses S. Grant, not knowing what Frederick Douglass said about him and not knowing about his record. We're seeing a lot of that kind of thing happening today. Can you talk about that and the importance of really, like you talked about factivism, but factivism with regard to knowing our history so that we know what we're doing today?
Right. Well, it's interesting because I'm not sure which human being can be ever hailed in the statue form. I'm not a big person. I'm not big on the whole. Sometimes certain things can become idols, right? And we're told by scripture not to have idols. I understand that. I think it is good, however, to commemorate certain things and certain achievements and certain people. Are they going to be perfect? Not a one. But
Never.
Somehow there's this bizarre. It's all because this, you got the Black Lives Matter movement. You have, this anti-racist movement, which in and of itself is often very racist. But the problem is there's no sense of history. Not only do they pull down Ulysses S. Grant, they pull down statues of Frederick Douglass. It's mind-blowing, the lack of knowledge, the lack of awareness, the lack of logic that happens in these cases. I think it's important for us to have these historical markers. Absolutely. I think it's impossible for us to purge from the public sphere anyone who's ever had a wrong ideology. I think we discuss those things. I think we point them out. Absolutely. But it's impossible. The funny thing is the people they're replacing with the, San Francisco school district is replacing, they're pulling out Jefferson, they're pulling out Washington, and the people they're replacing it with are deeply flawed in other areas.
Right.
But this is the problem, just not understanding. Here in DC, I was working with Star Parker of the Center for Urban Renewal and Education. We had this rally at a park in DC to protect the emancipation statue with Lincoln and the emancipated slave. And it was a statue that Frederick Douglass dedicated, paid for by Black Union soldiers. I mean, it just blows the mind. But this is why there's a huge difference between activism and factivism.
Yeah.
It's not that we have to agree totally with each other, but we should be proactive in understanding, wait a minute, let me know a little bit more about this before I act, well, quite honestly, like a fool. Because that's what we saw throughout the summer. And we're continuing to see this bizarre purge. I mean, soon it's going to be people of faith because Christianity is offensive and Christianity is, it employs hate speech. I mean, where does it end if a particular group who's the majority deems that this is not a worthy ideology, this is not a worthy worldview, and anybody who holds it, we're going to silence you, and then we're going to purge those things in the public sphere that symbolize it. Wow, that's a scary thing.
Yeah. Well, Ryan, I want to thank you for the time that you've taken today and also for all your hard work through the Radiance Foundation. I just pray a blessing upon you, strength and health for you and your family. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Craig.